Okay, so I was going to tell Laura how grateful I am because although she says I have all this expertise, you realize that it's not until Laura or someone calls me and says, would you give a talk? And then I actually wrote down all the talks that I've given here, and it's amazing what I've actually learned, because once you have to give a talk, then you really have to sort of learn about it, right, Laura? So I gave a talk here on Mary Ann Papanek Miller's work, and then what is art now? So I got to learn a little bit about what is art now. Then I gave a talk on your new space and assemblage. I gave a talk on my Katai, because I'm a big fan of Katai. I gave a talk on still life and on Faith Ringgold. I learned all about Faith Ringgold. And the very first one was the art auction that was like 13 or 14 years ago now. But I look exactly the same. Okay. So the way I have this talk set up tonight is I'm going to actually start, now let me see if I can do this. I'm going to actually start with the artist and then actually move through some of his images to give you a little history background on him, although I'm quite sure that everyone in this room has some idea about who Andy Warhol is. And then go to the camera and the work that he did with the Big Shot, the camera that produced the Polaroids that you see in the room next door, most of them at any rate. Some of the silver gelatin prints are also a part of this gift. And I'll just say right from the start that this is a gift that was extraordinarily generous and a little bit unprecedented. And the Andy Warhol Foundation determined that they would give the smaller color Polaroids and some black and white silver prints to universities throughout the country. And there were 180 universities and colleges that received this gift, and WSU was one of those institutions. And that's the lone gift that we have here at MAM. So you know Andy Warhol a little bit. His background is Ukrainian. He's a Pittsburgh boy. He was early on identified as a very talented draftsperson. He was recognized as a young man as being very gifted in that fashion with drafting. He was actually identified and taken out of high school and had this special opportunity to do drawing at the Carnegie Institute. And at the time, he was already completely enthralled by celebrity. And even then, when he was going to the Carnegie Institute, he was carefully identifying the cars that were dropping off the other kids he was studying with, what they were wearing, what their mothers looked like. He was very attuned to that sort of thing. He eventually went to Carnegie Tech in the late 40s and studied there and earned a degree. And in 1949, he headed to New York City. And within a very short period of time, he had established himself as a graphic artist, as a designer of advertisements. He was working for Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, Glamour. He had connections very, very early on, like within a year of ending up in New York City. And we probably all know his shoe work. He received an actual commission, a contract to produce advertisements for I. Miller, and he did shoes. And he said that I was getting paid for it and getting paid very well. I mean, he established his initial credentials as a commercial artist, and he was proud of that. I mean, he truly was very satisfied with his position as a commercial artist. He felt he was actually hanging out with the right people. He was going to department stores and buying some very pricey items. He said, well, I'm working for good money, and whatever they tell me to do, I'll do. If they tell me to draw a shoe, that's what I do. If they tell me to correct it, I'll do it, because he felt like he was a part of the right circle. He was, and it's interesting to me, and there's a lot going on here that I thought, wow, while I was reading that, I thought, boy, this would really make for an interesting, additional study, as if I need anything more. But he, because of his commercial background and because he was enthralled with celebrity and with products, commercial products that he, identified with or actually saw as being an elevated form of art, he was on the outs with the real art people. So although he wanted to be friends with people like Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, he wasn't. And it's interesting that they were all in some ways either to a greater or lesser degree, closeted. They weren't openly gay, and yet they all shared this sexual orientation. But Robert Rauschenberg and Johns thought that Andy was swish. He was way too swish. He liked shoes. He was too feminine. And these guys were more a part of this macho, art making. And so they really disdained him and rejected him, and he really was very hurt by that. And I don't think that that part of his life at precisely this time in the early 60s has actually been recognized and researched all that very much. But it may have been one of the reasons why he thought, well, fine, if you're not going to accept me in this hot, real art venue, then I'm going to do what I love anyway, and that's soup cans. And so he initially did this in 1962, and I was just talking with Amy Pettit this morning. Some of these early works are actually painted. So this work, which was, of course, the very famous work that's now at MoMA, are the 32 cans that are actually hand-painted. And the only part of this series, it's a series, that is actually stamped or in any way has that sort of reproduction, is the little fleur-de-lis decoration at the bottom of the can. And that he had a rubber stamp that he had carved himself, and he was stamping each of those on the canvas by hand. And then he said, well, I want to move really to screen printing. I'd like to, move away from this hand painting, this meticulous hand painting, and do something else. The rubber stamp method I've been using to repeat images seems too homemade. And so I want something that will give more an assembly line effect. And his first stars that he's doing are men. So the first stars he's actually experimenting with in terms of screen imagery are Warren Beatty and Troy Donahue. And that's Troy Donahue down there in the lower right. And the little Troy Donahue that he made was actually a not very big image either. It was kind of intimate, just like these Polaroids. So there's a lot that I was learning while I was doing this, because I always associate Andy Warhol with, well, Marilyn and Jackie and women, and yet these early experiments that he was doing were actually screen heads of men. And so then, of course, in '62, he actually makes one of his early screen prints, and it's of Marilyn Monroe, and it's just after her death. She dies in August of '62, and he actually writes about this experience of seeing Marilyn, or experiencing Marilyn's death, and hearing about it, and seeing the ongoing information about her death in the newspaper and the radio and the television. And I'll tell you again a little bit later, but he was addicted to that stuff. People said that when they would go to his various places in New York City during the time that he was living and moving around a little bit, first in Midtown and then downtown, the place was always just a cacophonous, noisy array of different things that were turned on. Radios here, televisions there, and of course, his mother moved in with him and lived downstairs. She had her various TVs and radios too, and it was just this riot of noise. And this is part of the reason why I think he was so fixated too on stars that would have been constantly talked about. And so in this case, what you have is actually a silk screen. So he painted this gold backdrop. You can see that there's this gold backdrop. And then he actually applied color first, an underpainting of color, just broadly yellow pigment for the face, and some additional just pure color here for where the collar of her outfit is, and then her eyebrows. And then he screen printed an image over that underpainting. And as you know, he created multiple Marilyns. There are, this Marilyn, of course, is gold Marilyn, but there are many other Marilyns, and he had these various screens as well that he created so that he could reproduce Marilyns. The original publicity still, the photograph that served as the source for this image is the image that you see there on the left. And actually Michael Fried, whom I think of as sort of the part of the minimalist, abstract, expressionist criticism camp, actually talks about the Marilyn, and he says it's the mouth. It's the mouth that served as that punctum, that point where you can actually tell that she's smiling, but she's also in some ways a little bit, you can tell she's a little tense and smiling. It's like a fake smile. And so there's this discussion about how Andy could identify the place where someone wasn't was revealing how hard it was to be a celebrity. And the mouth is where it is here. And you actually truly do get it there in the image on the left. And you may know, too, that there are actually images of Marilyn's lips. So he understood that. He actually understood, too, that it was the mouth that signaled this tension between wanting to be step back and then the necessity of coming forward and being the star. And so you probably have seen those repeated lips that he did, too. Now, this is really interesting about what happens right here in 63. So overall, there's an arc here, an arc where he does Soup Cans, a product. Then he does Marilyn Monroe after she's dead. She's a product. And then he takes a pause and he actually creates Ethel Scull's portrait based on images that he made in a photo booth. And he grabs her. She thinks she's going to go see Richard Avedon. She thinks she's going for a sitting with Richard Avedon. He's like, come on, Ethel. He drags her down to a photo booth on Broadway. And she says he's got about $100 in quarters. And he says, get in that booth. He actually tells her, he goes, get in that booth, start smiling and talking, because time is money. And so she's like, okay. And so there are how many? There's like 34 of the 4 stripped photo booth images that he then used to translate into this screen, this acetate positive that then would create the screen that he then printed over to create Ethel Scull 36 times. And you're just seeing one section, but what I want to show to you is that this really the earliest image where he's looking to someone who's not a very recognized star. She's just a recently affluent person. I think Mr. Scull is making money in taxis. So she's just recently affluent, and she gets just as much out of Warhol. In fact, she gets more out of Warhol than Warhol gets out of her, but he's thinking of her as a future patron. But here's the photo booth, and my life had all the glamour and glitter of a Hollywood starlets. So in 62, you do, Andy Warhol does Marilyn Monroe, and now in 63, he's elevating the taxi, magnate's wife to the realm of Marilyn Monroe, and he's doing it through the photo booth. But what I also wanted to point out is you can see that he's just using a solid color as the background here. He's not doing any of that individual painting around the underpainting for the face. And then in 64, he turns his attention to Jackie Onassis, or Jackie Kennedy at the time. He appropriated, very early now in 63, 8 photographs of Jackie culled from newspapers and Life magazine, and started in 64 to begin silk screening these photographs onto these pre-colored grounds. He made more than 300 Jackie paintings. Today, of course, they're worth millions of dollars, but this transition now to a woman who had lived through this experience, and Andy Warhol's interest in following sort of a progression through what her life was like just before her husband's death and then after his death, because of course the picture in blue, interestingly enough, almost like a precursor of the mourning that she's going to experience. She was wearing pink, but the backdrop is blue. Is the image, of course, of her landing at Love Field in Dallas, on the day that her husband is shot. So somewhat oddly, several years later, even though Andy said, the whole nation became enthralled by the media coverage, Andy Warhol said, well, John F. Kennedy was handsome, young, smart, but it didn't bother me that much that he was dead. What bothered me was the way television and radio were programming everybody to feel so sad. It seemed like no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't get away from the thing. So he's talking about the perverse, just pervasiveness of this information about this person. And then, of course, 4 years later, he becomes the focus of this information. And the person whom you see there to the left of Andy Warhol in this newspaper, of course, is Valerie Solanas, who's, I think, the only member and also the president's secretary and treasurer of SCUM, the Society for Cutting Up Men. Yeah, it's true. She's in it. There's a long, of course, story about why she's so angry at Andy for not producing her play. And I've never read the play, but I can imagine there were other people who had already read the play, and it said, oh, no one's ever going to produce this. But Andy never wanted to disappoint anybody, so he didn't ever tell her outright that he wasn't going to. He'd say, well, come back later. I think I might want to be someday I might be interested in that play. And that year, 68, 69, is really when there's a big transition at the factory, because she was a part of this group that would hang out at the factory. And if you've seen the first part of the documentary, you know that just about anyone could show up. And she could show up, and that's how she did. She just walked right in and shot him. And then this is the Avedon photograph of Andy Warhol's torso after that attempt on his life. I mean, he was brutally injured and needed quite a bit of reconstruction, as you can see from the scarring and the stitching here, the stitches on his body. He could have easily died from that. So let's talk about this wacky camera, the Big Shot. This is a camera that was manufactured between 71 and 73. And it's interesting because it really saved Polaroid's neck, basically, because they were working on the SX70, but it wasn't ready yet for promotion or for sale. It was still in its development stage. So they came up with this Big Shot. And it was cheap, it was very cheap. It was like $19.98. At retail price, no, $19.95, excuse me, that's $19.95. It was a very cheap camera. It's pretty strange looking, as you can see. It had a plastic lens, socket, and diffuser for these magic cubes, right? Very inexpensive camera. It had a non-adjustable rangefinder. So this means that when Andy holds the camera, he has to actually walk back and forth to the person he's taking a portrait of. He can't actually in any way focus. And the Big Shot has this, the Big Shot shuffle that they promote in their ads. And there in bold in the second paragraph, you see portraits that you can't mess up. Andy always had 2 or 3 with him. He kept them in his apartment in Paris. Actually had a relationship with Polaroid, where Polaroid actually would help him, like repair broken Big Shots and provide Big Shot cameras for him so that he could use those. And of course, this is just an ad from Life magazine in April 1971. This is the kind of camera where once you took the picture, you'd have about 3 to 4 feet. That was the perfect focus. And you would actually go back and forth until you had the person in focus. So imagine you'd walk forward and you'd walk back. And so imagine that kind of almost this, teasing, playing around with the sitter. Then you get into focus, and then you just click on the front. There's that little red clicker on the front, and then you get this image that comes out. You wait 60 seconds, and then you open it, and you have the image. So there's also this moment of discovery, like, ooh, what do we get? Now the SX70, well, you skip that step. It just comes out and develops right in front of you. But in the meanwhile, you have this camera, which you can see how big it is. It's just this odd, bulky thing. I mean, it's just bizarre. It's almost like an assault. I mean, it seems like an assault, like you have this thing coming towards you. I was trying to imagine what would it be like to sit for Andy Warhol and have this camera coming toward you and him moving back and forth. I mean, I think that would feel kind of aggressive. So I have now a group of images to talk to you about the portrait process and how these portraits are actually done with the Polaroid, what the actual steps were. He took thousands and thousands of these Polaroid portraits. And I actually have this quote from Vincent Fremont, who became the vice president of Andy Warhol Enterprises, more on that in just a moment, when he moves out of the factory and actually cleans up his act. He leaves the factory and actually moves to a place that looks like a business. And this portrait period, particularly in the 70s, is a business. He has people coming. If there's a portrait commission, we have a luncheon. It's fun. You sit down with people. You never know who's going to be at lunch. You could have a pop star. Maybe it would be someone else who is famous. We wouldn't say that they were coming. We would tone down. Oh, no. If you didn't know who was coming, you would tone down the lunch. But if you had a really great lunch, you would, of course, really put on the spread. And they'd always go to Balducci's. And I think that this is really great. It's like I imagine Balducci's sort of being like the lower Manhattan good food store. Because, you know, you'd go there and get all this fancy stuff. And then Andy would show up, make them very comfortable. And the women would have to go through, first of all, this process of getting made up. And initially, Andy would put all this white makeup off on many of the women's sitters. And you'll see that in those portraits in the other room. Some of these people seem like they've been all like put white paint all over them, and they have. And that was so that that flash would go off and make them even flatter, that the figure would even seem flatter. And so these women would have their makeup on, and then probably the Queen of Norway doesn't have to take off her top, but a lot of the women, he would ask them to take off their tops, and then he would put on this white and blue wrap. And in some of the images, you can see it. And in fact, this Vincent Freeman says, well, I can always look and tell, you know, about when an image was done because I can see the blue and white wrap that was used for many of the women so that the top shoulders would be revealed. But if you're Queen Sonia, that doesn't happen. And so you can see how white her face is. And the makeup artist, well, first Andy did it, and then he said, I'm all done making up these women. I'm going to hire someone. So after, probably by the mid-70s, he had someone who was officially there to make up the women, put on big, like red lipstick, and exaggerate those features so that the photograph, when it was completed, could more readily translate sort of big blocks of information eventually to the screen print. So you can see him moving here, probably even doing the shuffle. You see how he's moving back and forth. And you see on the back there, you can see all of the actual Polaroid shots that he's already made. So he would do 50, well, 40, 50, 60. He would just keep shooting and have all of these images out on the table. And then he would get together and with the sitter, go through them and try to make a decision about which one they would like to use. And so, oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Here we go. So then, of course, they would be translated to these canvases. Now, the canvases he would paint, you know, these backdrops fairly flat, using different colors. And then the screen print would actually, the screen would actually be printed on top. And of course, he'd have assistance for that. He always sent out everything for the actually making of the acetate positive negative, the transference from the Polaroid to this acetate intervention or intervening step that then eventually made the screen. And then the screens would come back, and then those would happen either at the factory or at the business once they moved to lower Manhattan. So here she is. You can see all that white makeup on and these exaggerated red lips. And then Arthur Danto said, well, people were competed to be portrayed by Warhol. And there was something that I thought really interesting about this, that the subjects wanted to be seen. And so through Andy, they had this entree to sort of being seen. Now they would be looked at. And this desire to gain access to the environment in which people would be looking at you was really important. You should also know that this is precisely the time that he starts Interview Magazine, and actually a vehicle so that he can reproduce more of his Polaroid prints through this magazine and enhance that notion of celebrity. So here's a celebrity we all know, and of course you can imagine that Debbie Harry doesn't have to be told to take off her top because she comes with her top already, you know, mostly off. And so here he is actually doing Blondie, making several of these shots of Blondie. And then there is actually a Blondie, maybe one or two in there in the exhibition here in the other room. And so here's the actual Polaroid, and you can see that it's pretty tight, right? It's quite close to her, fairly intimate, really frontal, like an icon. I mean, I think there's a lot that has little bits done about this iconic look, like a Madonna and an icon, but probably not as much as could be done about why he wants this kind of image and how he understands how religious imagery and the conventions of religious imagery can now be used to create stars. And initially, he's just really doing stars. He's doing Debbie Harry, he's doing Mick Jagger, he's doing queens like Queen of Norway. And then he's actually transforming just everyday, recently affluent people like his earlier Ethel Skull into this pantheon, elevating these people to the pantheon. Now this is where, Tad, you want to show that link. So this is, of course, one of the screens that was done, done of Debbie Harry. And then Ted's going to show you what the Sotheby's link is going to let us know about the sale of these images. Now it is Debbie Harry, but that one of the permutations or variations on this, one yellow blondie, went for little over $3 million at Sotheby's in, was that 2008, I think. Can't quite remember 2008, but it's right in the range of their estimate where they thought, well, somewhere between 2.5 million and 3.5 million. So then you can just go back and see what's next here. Yeah, good. So this is what I want to show you too. There's this transition during this time for the Polaroid. Andy is moving to a different place. He's going downtown. He's giving up the factory, which is up there on the upper left, where there's just this chaotic melange of weird people hanging out all the time, meet people he doesn't know. And it switches or makes this transition really to Studio 54. And all you have to do, I was thinking, how could I get some disco music in the background? It would be the perfect backdrop for these images. And then, well, you know, I've been doing a lot of work on Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the portrait painter of celebrity in the 18th century. And there are quite a number of similarities between these two guys. Both Sir Joshua Reynolds and Andy Warhol had an appointment book. They were very careful about who was coming in. They would make sure that various sitters would actually overlap so they could see who was coming or going. And you'd say, oh, did you see Debbie Harry going? Well, gosh, I'm getting my portrait done. And so, and they would use various means to exaggerate the stardom of these images. And of course, Sir Joshua Reynolds was using 18th century conventional clues or hints or strategies so that you could read elegance and some kind of celebrity status. And of course, what Warhol's doing is that he's creating a milieu in which celebrity is happening. He's the focus of this celebrity venue. People are coming and going. He's becoming known for doing Jane Fonda, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Do you see the blue and white little bit of material on her back there? That's the famous blue and white material right there on the back of Jane Fonda. Farrah Fawcett and Halston. Thank you, Laura. I went down the Farrah Fawcett rabbit hole a couple of nights ago, read all about how Ryan O'Neal is in court trying to keep his Farrah Fawcett image. You know, the son wants it instead. And because, of course, Farrah Fawcett recently died, and so there's quite a bit of fighting over the Andy Warhol portrait. And one of them is there on the, one of them is here on the right. I don't think that's Ryan's, but it's one of them. So there's Farrah Fawcett. And then Pia Zadora. Do you see the blue and white? There it is. So, you know, now you're going to start looking for the little blue and white cloth that some of the women had to put on. But, I mean, Pia Zadora, who remembers her? But, of course, he loved her. He loved her. He actually said, oh, Pia, I just love her. Pia's like all those tiny girls we know who always grabbed the spotlight. She's so sweet. I think she's going to be a big star. And of course, that's why he wants to promote her. He, of course, made an image for her. And there would be many. You paid $25,000 for a sitting. You would never get to keep your Polaroid. He kept all the Polaroids. People would say, oh, I want just one Polaroid. I mean, there's 40 of them. No, you couldn't take any of the Polaroids. You could only get the image, the actually screened image. But he also did black and white images of Pia and a whole bunch of other celebrities and friends and people he's hanging out with at Studio 54. And some of those are also in the other room, these black and white images that were also part of this gift. Heather Watts is a dancer. He was very interested in that entire circle of dancers, designers, fashion designers. Here is Daryl Lilly. She's a collector. So he's connecting with those people who will bring money and, of course, buy other works from him. But you can see all this makeup on these figures as they move through. Bianca Jagger, you get Bianca Jagger, and then you can get Mick, and then you get the children. It's really a business. It's a business, and he's making these connections. And if you look at, say, Sonja, the Queen of Norway, I saw the entire series of Polaroids that were done of her. There are profiles and frontal and, looking up, looking down, but they're always of that same format because you have to be only a certain distance. So you're always going to get this same, pretty much the same part of the figure. Joan Collins, there are actors and actresses who are showing up pretty routinely and then having their images done as well. I'm sure there's some blue and white fabric down there, but Tina Chow, who's a designer, fashion designer, and then here is her image. These were anywhere from in the 20-inch range in terms of their squares to up to 40. I think that one that we saw of Blondie is in the 40-inch range, so some of them can be quite large. Princess Caroline, she was only 26 when she posed for him. I mean, she'd already gone through a hasty marriage and divorce. And she was a regular at Studio 54. I think that, she hadn't kind of calmed down or been tamed quite yet. So this is when she's still hanging out in New York City before she's gone back to Monaco and assumed her place. And then I wanted you to see that there are a lot of permutations of these prints. After all, now if you have a screen, you can put that screened image of the sitter over any number of different painted surfaces. And he did men. He did, of course, designers who'd come in, and he said, oh, I always like to see the hands for the men because the hands are so important for men, because men always are holding a cigarette or holding a drink, and so the hands are important for men. Or, of course, for sports figures, they have to hold like their thing, their ball, like football, basketball, baseball. I don't know, I guess, Muhammad Ali uses his hands, but of course these are so predictable, like who's a celebrity at the time? They would have made their way to Warhol. And here's my doppelganger, right? The guy who looks just kind of a lot like me. But Ed, I'm glad that I look like Wayne Gretzky in the 70s and not Wayne Gretzky now, because I don't know if you've seen him now, and it's not nice. But, this is okay. It kind of looks like the guys I went to school with in northern Minnesota. It's okay, Ed. And then Keith Haring, of course, was a fixture, and his boyfriend Juan Rivera, and this might actually have gone into one of the boxes that Andy kept for his nudes, which he called, let's see, I want to make sure, the sex parts box. He had a box where when he had enough of the portraits and he was just at home with friends and taking photographs with his big shot, he would move down the body a little bit, and then when he did that, he had boxes and boxes of these Polaroids called the sex parts. At least they're labeled, so you know. And then this, R.C. Gorman, I mean, it's been great for me, Laura. Honestly, I thought, well, who's R.C. Gorman? And just the other night on Tuesday night with the students in Art History 440, we were going through old Art in American art news. And from the 70s, they're filled with images by R.C. Gorman. I mean, there is all this R.C. Gorman imagery. I mean, you couldn't pick up a magazine, an arts magazine in the 70s and not be sold an R.C. Gorman, or more than one time. And so he was clearly someone who had a great recognition during the 70s. And then, of course, Mick Jagger. So there were superstars, and then there were just normal people like, I don't know, like normal people, normal rich people who could go and say, well, Andy Warhol did Mick Jagger and now he's going to do me. I'm just a normal rich person, but now that I'm using the same artist as Mick Jagger, I get to be elevated somehow. And so there are these magnificent shots of young Mick Jagger that Andy did. And then you may or may not know that Andy then also, in 1969, was commissioned to do the Sticky Fingers album cover. And so he actually has a whole a stack of shots, and I think this has kept some researchers busy probably for decades, trying to figure out which young man in tight jeans is actually the model for the Sticky Fingers cover. And the overall consensus right now, because I know you're wondering, is that it's this man, and his name is, let me just see here, people agree that it's probably Joe D'Alessandro, who had actually been in several of Andy's films, including Flesh, Trash, and Dracula. Now, I haven't done any careful comparison here, but I think that this is probably moving toward the sex parts direction. But did you know that, and I do have this actual album at home, of course I do, but when you zip down the real zipper on the front of the Sticky Fingers album cover, you open it up, and of course there's some white BVDs in there, but it actually has Andy Warhol's signature in there. Did you know that? I mean, it's really kind of interesting. So many of these, if not all of them, have Andy Warhol's name in the lower right-hand corner in a stamp. It's actually stamped on the surface. And so he used a similar approach when he did the Sticky Fingers album cover. Now, the nudes. So everyone's of legal age, and they're not really that bad. But I do want to talk to you just briefly about this, because it's interesting to me that once Andy made the transition to the SX70, he was more interested in doing nude imagery. There was this connection between the SX70 and the images that he did of nudes, and I don't know why. I mean, I'm trying to figure out why that happened, but as a matter of fact, if you start to do just a little bit of reading, you find out that the SX70, which was actually the special experiment, the 70th special experiment that Edwin H. Land was doing in terms of creating instant photography, was also the camera when it came out in '72. It's the same year that Deep Throat came out, and there was this increase in all of this hardcore pornography that was available, and some people actually make the link to this camera that you can have, and well, you can get close and take pictures. And of course, Andy already had all this experience with the big shot, and so now he actually would use his SX Land camera, which you see right here. And if you remember Boogie Nights from 1997, of course, Roller Girl spends most of her time in the movie taking pictures with the SX70 Land camera and getting these instant photographs. It's far less cumbersome than the big shot, and a little bit more I don't know, you can portable, a little bit more portable. But I liked this because I thought, well, this gives you a good idea. I mean, there are thousands of these images, thousands of them, and they were carefully kept, maintained in a box called the sex parts, probably many boxes. There were also boxes called torsos, and he studied torsos. They're quite valuable. When they come up for sale, they hit records. But I've only got a couple, so if you're upset by that, then don't look. But I thought there should be a comparison between maybe some of these and Robert Mapplethorpe, because Robert Mapplethorpe was hanging out at maybe not the factory, but certainly by this time in the mid-'70s, late '70s, and I wondered, I have to go back to Patti Smith's Just Kids and see if they were ever talking about going to Andy Warhol, because Warhol was doing this imagery and then Mapplethorpe was. And so I think Mapplethorpe is actually thinking, wow, well, what if I took these Polaroids that are being done and are being shoved into the sex parts box, and what if I really made these more like high-end, like an Ansel Adams photograph, except it's a male nude. And so these are some of the torsos and body parts that he does, and that's it, so don't be so nervous. Those are all the nudes, but there's many more, like lots and lots and lots. And so then finally, I just want you to know that in the early '80s, he did a whole series called The American Icons. So by this time, he's really identifying them as iconic. Now he's saying, well, women, human beings used to have the Madonna or Mary, and what does America have? Well, we have Aunt Jemima, she's one of our icons. And then he did, of course, Uncle Sam, Santa Claus, I think Santa Claus is here somewhere, and then The Wicked Witch of the West. So he does Margaret Hamilton, and there's actually this marvelous little story about having her come over and taking photographs of her. And he took a whole series of photographs late in her life. Of course, now this is when The Wicked Witch of the West is, 50 years later, 50 years after she'd made her 45 years after she'd made her achieved stardom as the Wicked Witch of the West in the movie with Judy Garland. And yet she was still a stage actress. She was still starring in theater, starring on stage. And she was invited to come and participate in this American Icons series that he did. And then he died, somewhat surprisingly, really, although he had had a lot of problems since being shot in '68. He'd had a lot of trouble, but in '87 he finally went in for gallbladder surgery, and it was such a routine surgery that no one could have predicted that he would have died at the age of 58 on the 22nd of February 1987. But by that time he'd moved up to the Rollet, so I think that's the camera he has there. Is it a Pentel? I can't tell. But now he has a smaller little camera that he's using. Oh, I'm good, 45 minutes. So that's it, I'm actually done. So you can ask me some questions if you want, and maybe I can answer them or maybe I can't. So thank you. Yeah. So are there any questions? Maybe I can answer? Oh, okay.
I'm curious about the quote in response to JFK's assassination.
Yeah.
Critical of the media.
Yeah.
It seems to sort of contradict what he was well on his way to doing himself, sort of.
Yeah. So he's not.
Reference to image and
right. So here. Where did I have it again? I got to go back here. What bothered me was the way television and radio were programming everybody to feel so sad. It seemed like no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't get away from the thing. And yet, you're right. This is eventually where he's going to end up. So he's talking about this in '63 and '64. We're responding to what he is, engaged in doing, looking at Jackie and appropriating those images and then reproducing them hundreds of times, right? But I wonder if maybe he's trying to actually reduce the number of images somehow, retain some kind of special quality to them, even though it's a screen print. But, at least he's taking her from the public realm and putting it into his realm. I think that he also has this idea that whatever he touches is more special, right? So what do you think? Might that be the...
I'm hearing the quote, I think maybe he's talking about sort of that mood of sadness.
Yeah.
In which the story is portrayed, and he might consider the lightness or like uplifting the color, flattening the graphic quality.
Well, yeah. And I think there's a lot going on here. What I found interesting was his response to television and radio, since it also, when the sources are reading, almost all the sources will say he had something on all the time. He called it the tape recorder he used all the time. You probably know that he famously had this tape recorder all the time. And he would have it with him all the time. In fact, he had it so often that he said, "It's my wife. My wife is the tape recorder." And he would tape people at these lunches. People would come for the lunch. Their sitters would come, and he would turn on the tape recorder. And he always wanted to get good conversation so that he could listen to it later. Always had to have something on. Yeah. Oh, Marianne, hi.
What do you say about Basquiat and Warhol?
I think that it was the climate of the early 80s, mid 80s, probably meeting at places like, wasn't he in a group called Mud? Basquiat was a player in a band, and I think it was actually through the band first that Warhol met Basquiat. I might be wrong about this, but I think it was actually through Debbie Harry and that whole circle of music that he met Basquiat. And then the collaboration with Basquiat was actually pretty late. It's a later thing that Warhol's doing, this this relationship. And I think by that time, Warhol kind of thought of himself as a master, like, now I can help the younger artists. I was just reading at the very end about how right before his death he was thinking about how can I help younger artists. He'd actually ask younger artists, do you have enough money? Do you have, is there any way I can help you? So he was starting to see of himself less as a star maker and as someone who was really moving into sort of a mentoring realm. And so I think he thought of himself in that way with Basquiat. I really do. I think he was a mentor. Yeah.
You said that at some point he moves from the factory and wants to clean up his act or whatever, so to speak, and then he's at Studio 54, which seems to be like the last one to go to clean up the act.
Yeah.
So, but so these pictures that are happening, they're not like these kind of like boozy, late night kind of impromptu things.
No.
Despite where it's located, these are still very much.
No. And I guess maybe I'm misleading all of you a little bit. I mean, Studio 54 truly is getting cleaned up from the factory, because by the time Valerie's taking the gun up there, it's just, it's a mess. I mean, there's heroin and amphetamines, and people are falling on the ground, and they're sleeping on the red couch, and Andy feels like he's out of control. This way, all of the fun is off-site. And he can either go home or go to his business, the Andy Warhol Enterprise. I mean, think of that. It's like, now I'm starting a business. And these sitters who came, I mean, maybe some of the sex parts were done, late at night or after you've been to Studio 54. But that's where he's meeting his clients. But they're arranging to come by at 9 in the morning or at lunchtime. It's lunchtime.
So it wasn't actually in the studio, it was somewhere.
Yeah, oh no, they would actually go to the business. Yeah, no, at Studio 54 is where he's meeting people, and no, I'm misled you. Yeah, I know I misled you. No, he's meeting people. That's where, you see all those pictures of him hanging out with all of the people, dancing a little bit, maybe with the camera, but he's actually meeting people and then meeting the next day to take the photographs at his business. Yeah, which was separate from the house. I mean, he had a separate business now, separate from his home. Even the factory was separate from where he lived. So thank you very much. That's great. Thanks.